welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a subject that's, well, it's probably crossed your mind in different ways, maybe without you quite putting a name to it. It's this really fascinating, sometimes surprising intersection of ethics and art.
Yeah.
You know, as someone who likes getting up to speed quickly and thoroughly,
Yeah.
you deal with ethical stuff all the time.
Yeah.
But maybe you haven't thought explicitly about how deep it runs with art.
Exactly. And this is kind of your shortcut, right? To get a handle on that connection. We've got a bunch of reflections here looking at, well, everything from how we judge art compared to right and wrong.
Okay.
How art shapes our values, the limits we put on artists, censorship, how art can challenge things, whether it's all just taste versus truth, and even, does the artist's life matter for the art itself?
So what's the mission today?
The mission is to pull out the key insights, those moments maybe, to give you a new lens for looking at art through this ethical frame.
Okay, let's dive right in that. First up, moral judgments, our sense of right and wrong versus aesthetic judgments. Is this beautiful? Is it good art? How are they similar? How are they different?
Well, what's interesting right off the bat is that both often feel universal. Like when we say, that's wrong, or wow, that's beautiful, we often kind of feel like everyone should agree, right?
Yeah, there's that feeling.
But the basis for those feelings is usually different. Morality, it tends to be rooted in things like preventing harm, respecting rights, duty, well-being, and, pulling from ethical theories. Aesthetics, though, that leans more towards form, balance, maybe originality, the emotion it evokes, and it's generally much more open to different takes. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, as they say.
Right. But we do use some of the same words, don't we? Like, you could talk about the depth of a story's message and the depth of color in a painting.
Precisely. There's definitely a shared vocabulary there. But here's a key difference. Aesthetics often really embraces variety, even things that seem jarring or unexpected. Think about art that deliberately breaks the rules of harmony.
Okay.
Morality, though, especially in, say, a functioning society, it usually needs more fundamental agreement on things. Like you need consent, you need to avoid harm. It's generally less keen on radical deviations there.
So does that mean you could have a piece of art that people think is brilliant, really inventive?
Yeah.
But at the same time, it raises some pretty serious moral red flags.
Oh, absolutely. Take Banksy's Love is in the Bin. Remember when the girl with balloon painting shredded itself right after being awkward?
Yeah, I remember that. Wild.
Exactly. Aesthetically, loads of people saw it as this, genius critique of the art market.
Yeah.
Inventive, right?
Yeah.
But at the very same time, people were asking, hang on, is this vandalism, or did this manipulate the auction? So one act, but you've got aesthetic praise and moral questions bumping up against each other. That's the key insight, really how these different lenses apply to the same thing.
Okay, yeah, that example makes the distinction super clear. So moving on, how does actually engaging with art, watching films, listening to music, how does that shape our personal values? It's not just passive viewing, is it?
No, not at all. The sources really emphasize that art engages our moral imagination. It basically lets us step into different shoes, grapple with tough choices, but, in a safe space, vicariously.
Like a simulation?
Kind of, yeah. And neuroscience actually backs this up. Studies show that when we get really absorbed in a story, the parts of our brain tied to social reasoning, empathy, they light up.
Wow.
So it's almost like art is giving us practice for our ethical responses.
Yeah. Training
us in a way.
That's fascinating. Like ethical drills without the real-world fallout. Can you give some specific examples, maybe across different art forms?
Sure. Think about Bong Joon-ho's film Parasite. It uses that really dark humor to dig into class conflict, right? And the kind of morally gray choices people make just trying to survive in deeply unequal situations.
Very gray.
And the insight there is how that humor makes you uncomfortable. It forces you to question easy assumptions about fairness and who's good or bad. Or music. Kendrick Lamar's album To Pimp a Butterfly. It's this incredible weave of personal story and systemic critique. It definitely shaped how a lot of people understand race and justice.
Absolutely.
And then you have something totally different, like the interactive game, that dragon, Cancer. It puts you right into the emotional reality of a family dealing with a child's terminal illness. People who play it often talk about a real shift in how they think about suffering, empathy, care.
Yeah, those are powerful examples. It really shows how art can connect you to these issues in a way that just reading facts maybe doesn't.
Yeah.
Now, the sources also zoom in specifically on literature. Why is reading novels or stories seen as particularly important for ethical development?
Well, literature often offers this sustained, deep dive into characters' inner worlds. It's not quick. It's what you might call slow moral reflection.
Low reflection, I like that.
Yeah. And beyond just building empathy, which it does, literature exposes you to a whole range of ethical frameworks. You might encounter Confucian ideas of duty in one book, existentialist authenticity in another, maybe a feminist ethics of care somewhere else.
So it's like exploring different moral philosophies through characters.
Exactly. And it pushes you to navigate between them to see how they might clash or complement each other in complex situations.
Did you give an example?
Sure. Think about post-colonial fiction like Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things. It paints such a vivid picture of caste violence, forbidden love. It really challenges inherited prejudices. Or speculative fiction like Ursula K. Le Guin's story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Umalas.
Oh, yeah, that one's intense.
Right. It presents this seemingly a perfect utopia, but it rests on the perpetual suffering of one child. It forces you right up against that tension between, say, utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, and a more gut-level deontological feeling that some things are just wrong, period.
Yeah, it leaves you squirming.
And it's not just theory. There's actually research, like Gregory Calvert's work at Oxford, suggesting students who read complex literary narratives actually score higher on moral reasoning tests.
That's really compelling. So, okay, we've seen how art shapes ethics.
Yeah.
What about the other way around? Are there ethical lines that artists shouldn't cross? Or things we as viewers shouldn't consume?
Yeah, this is a big one. I mean, freedom of expression is obviously crucial, right? Especially in democratic societies.
Foundational.
But most societies do have some kind of red lines, usually around things like causing direct harm to living beings, serious invasions of privacy, or directly inciting violence or hatred. And digital tools, they've just thrown a whole new layer of complexity onto all of this.
Right, the digital world changes the game. Got any examples of these lines being tested or debated?
Definitely. Think about Damien Hirst's work with preserved animals. That sparked ongoing protests from animal rights groups, right? They argue it promotes a kind of speciesism, even if the animals are already dead.
Okay, yeah.
Or in the tech space, consider something like Stable Diffusion's deep privacy tool. On one hand, great for anonymizing faces, protecting privacy.
Seems useful.
But the flip side is the potential misuse for creating convincing deepfakes. And that raises huge ethical questions about deception, reputation, and so on.
That's a tricky balance.
Totally. And then there's the legal side, like the recent U.S. Supreme Court case, Warhol v. Goldsmith. That decision tightened up the rules around fair use, really highlighting that ongoing tug of war between protecting original creators and allowing others to remix and build on culture. It's all about balancing those ethical considerations.
These examples really show the friction point. So who draws these lines? What about government stepping in? Censoring art they think is immoral or, say, blasphemous.
Yeah, that's a really sensitive topic, and the approach varies wildly depending on the political system. In many liberal democracies, the guiding idea is often John Stuart Mill's harm principle. Basically, you can express yourself freely unless it directly incites harm, like violence or hatred, against others.
So the bar for censorship is quite high.
Generally, yes. But in more authoritarian states, the criteria are often way broader, much more subjective. Censorship might kick in for anything deemed offensive to national values, religious beliefs, or just critical of a government.
Can you contrast those? Give us some examples.
Sure. Think about the Charlie Hebdo trials in France. Despite the cartoons being deeply offensive to many Muslims, the courts repeatedly upheld the right to publish them, prioritizing freedom of expression, even shocking expression.
Okay, that's the liberal democracy model.
Right. Then contrast that with, say, underground rock bands in China, like Tang Dynasty historically. They often had to use allegory, really subtle language, to hint at themes like personal freedom or to reflect on history, always wary of crossing the state's censorship lines.
Walking a tightrope.
Exactly. And now, in the digital sphere, you see platforms like YouTube grappling with this. Their 2024 policy update about demonetizing videos for religious insult. Well, that raises all sorts of questions about private companies acting as censors, which is different from state censorship, but still a form of gatekeeping based on perceived offense or values.
It's definitely a complex landscape, from state control to platform policies.
Okay, let's flip the coin again. We talked about ethics limiting art. What about art challenging established moral values? How does it do that?
This is where art can be really powerful, even subversive. It can act like a mirror, sometimes a distorted funhouse mirror to society. It can shock people, make them uncomfortable, and force them to reevaluate norms they just took for granted.
How? What are the mechanisms?
Oh, various ways. It can be deliberately disruptive, use parody or satire, employ allegory like those Chinese rock bands, or maybe present counter-narrative stories from perspectives that are usually ignored or suppressed.
Can you give some examples of art doing that kind of challenging work? Absolutely. Think about performance art, like Marina Abramović's Rhythm Zero. She basically put herself and a table of objects, some dangerous, at the mercy of the audience for hours.
I remember reading about that. Pretty intense.
Yeah. It became this stark demonstration of how quickly social norms and limits can break down when the usual constraints are removed. Or Banksy, again, with his street art activism. His Ukraine Alive mural wasn't just graffiti, it repurposed his own famous image to make a direct statement about the war and refugees, kind of challenging how we think about charity and art's role in crisis.
Using his platform.
Exactly. And then there's technology like augmented reality. The Museum of Lost Objects project uses AR to overlay images of destroyed cultural artifacts onto the places where they once stood. It makes you confront the loss directly, prompting reflection on the ethics of conflict, development, cultural heritage. It challenges our values about what's worth preserving.
Those are really powerful examples of art pushing back. Which brings us to another big question. These judgments we make, moral ones and aesthetic ones, is there some kind of objective truth to them? Or is it all just subjective taste? Where do we land on that?
The taste versus truth debate. Yeah, there's a whole spectrum here. If you go full relativist, saying it's all just taste, you might end up undermining ethics too, like if nothing's really right or wrong.
Okay, that's one end.
Then the other extreme is a kind of rigid realism, insisting there's one right answer, which ignores how much context and culture shape our views.
So neither extreme feels quite right.
Probably not. A more, let's say, pragmatic view suggests that both moral and aesthetic standards are kind of constructed, right? They evolve through dialogue, education, shared experiences within communities. We develop criteria together.
It's a process, not a fixed thing. Can you illustrate that?
Sure. Think about autotune in pop music. Decades ago, many would have called it inauthentic, aesthetically bad.
Definitely. Cheating, almost.
Right. But now, it's a widely accepted, even defining aesthetic feature of certain genres. Standards evolved, or compare design aesthetics across cultures. Traditional Japanese wabi-sabi finds beauty in imperfection and simplicity. That contrasts sharply with, say, classical Western ideals, often focused on symmetry and perfection. But modern design, it often borrows from both, showing how our aesthetic appreciation grows and incorporates different values.
Okay.
Maybe one more. Remember that AI-generated painting, the portrait of Edmund de Bellamy, that sold at Christie's?
Yeah, that caused a stir.
It forced the art world to ask, what makes something valuable art if a human didn't directly create it in the traditional sense? It pushed beyond just does it look good into questions about innovation, intent, originality in this new AI context. So the criteria are constantly being debated and redefined.
That's fascinating how these new developments force us to rethink value. Okay, final point, and it's a really common one people grapple with. Can we, or maybe should we, separate the artist's moral character from how we value their work?
Oh boy, yeah. The million-dollar question. It comes up constantly, doesn't it?
All the time.
There are sort of two main camps. One idea is the death of the author, which basically says the artwork should stand on its own, judged independently of whoever created it, their life, their beliefs, their actions.
Just focus on the art itself.
Right. But then there's another view, sometimes called moral reception theory, which argues that, well, maybe we can't fully separate them, or maybe we shouldn't, especially if the artist's actions seem to directly contradict the message or values in their art. The context matters.
It feels like there's no easy universal answer here. What are some current examples that show this tension?
Well, think about online movements like petitions or calls for boycotts, say. The push to get Joe Rogan off Spotify over misinformation concerns a while back. That shows audiences actively applying moral filters to the creators they consume.
Right. Voting with their clicks or wallets.
Exactly. Or look at how we reassess historical figures. Cézanne, for instance. We can acknowledge his, let's say, problematic colonial attitudes, while museums still exhibit his groundbreaking art, often now with extra context explaining that side of him.
So acknowledging the complexity.
Trying to, yeah. And a huge one right now is the restitution debate returning artifacts like the Benin bronzes to Nigeria. This directly links the ethics of how the art was acquired, often through colonial violence, to its value and rightful ownership today. It forces Western museums to confront their own moral standing.
These examples really bring home how complex and, frankly, how relevant this separation issue is right now.
Absolutely. It shows this relationship between ethics and art isn't static. It's constantly being negotiated, reshaped by new information, social movements, technology.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway, the core insight for our listener?
I think the biggest thing is just recognizing how deeply intertwined ethics and art really are. It's a dynamic relationship, as we've seen with, Banksy's Shredder or AI art or Restitution debates. Our sense of what ought to be our ethics profoundly shapes how we make art, how we interpret it, how we feel about it. And art, in turn, shapes our ethics. They're constantly influencing each other.
That's a great summary, constant dialogue. Okay, so for you, our listener, here's a final thought to chew on. Think about a piece of art could be anything, a movie, song, painting, whatever that you encountered recently. Did any ethical thoughts, even lurking in the background, color your reaction to it? And maybe consider how being more aware of these ethical dimensions, the kinds of things we've talked about today, might actually enrich how you engage with art in the future. Keep exploring those intersections.
There's always more to find.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.